For the Vanderbilt CTSA Learning Health System Platform, and is chair of the AHRQ Healthcare Effectiveness and Outcomes Research Study Section. So we are very excited to hear from Dr. Kripalani today. Take it away.
Sarah, thanks so much for the kind introduction. And Katie and Russ, I very much appreciate the invitation to join you all today. I was asked to share the model for learning healthcare research at Vanderbilt with a focus on the pragmatic clinical trial piece. And my objectives for today are, want to set the broader stage, because the learning healthcare platform at Vanderbilt that we'll be focusing our conversation on today is one component of a broader ecosystem for learning health systems here. But I'm going to spend the majority of the time detailing our CTSA supported platform for supporting embedded pragmatic clinical trials and provide several examples of pragmatic trials that have been supported through this platform. And along the way, pepper in some lessons learned and share with you some future directions about where we're headed. I don't have any relevant financial disclosures, but I do want to acknowledge the generous support that we've received from a number of federal and other funding sources, as well as institutional funds to support this work. So specifically, our learning healthcare platform is a module within our CTSA that's supported by this UL1 award from NCATS. And we have institutional funds and some training grants too that I'll share a little bit about. I know this audience is very familiar with learning health systems, and I'm just going to give a couple of slides to frame the conversation about the relationship between science and practice. As we know, in a traditional model, it's really a one-way pipeline in which scientific discovery moves, generates evidence, and that hopefully will ultimately inform clinical care. But it's a very leaky pipeline, and there's a lot of missed opportunities along the way. As it's been conceived by the National Academy of Medicine and other groups, the learning health system is more of an iterative process of surveilling the local care environment and the community for opportunities for improvement, designing interventions, implementing them, evaluating them, adjusting where needed, and then bringing that information back into the care of the patients and the community that are being served in that environment. Now, there's not just one model for doing this. I know you all had a recent presentation about the many models that are used for learning health systems. I'm going to be sharing what we're doing at Vanderbilt, which is still very much an evolutionary process. One of the sets of characteristics that's present across all these models, though, for continuing learning health systems are the integration of science and informatics, real-time access to knowledge, and digital capture of as much information as possible. It's just not practical or feasible to manually collect a lot of data to inform healthcare. And so in today's electronic health record environment, we really rely on capturing that information and repurposing it. Clinician-patient partnerships are also key to this, and particularly empowering patients to be part of their care and getting their input on care model improvements is really critical in learning health systems. The incentives have to be realigned. We have to move away from a fee-for-service, pay-as-you-go model and incentivize value and efficiency in care delivery outcomes, and do so in a transparent way if we're really going to encourage the continued growth of these models. And none of this would be possible without the appropriate institutional culture that values learning, admits when opportunities for improvement are present, and strives to develop competencies among everybody working in the health system so that we can all work together to continue to improve. So overall, the Vanderbilt Learning Health ecosystem, as I'll call it, consists of many, many parts. There are many methods and structures that undergird all of this. And I'm not going to talk about all of this today. But I do want to acknowledge that there are many components of this overall process of continuous improvement in our medical center. And I suspect if you think about your own local environments, you would identify many of these same components. One of them is quality improvement. And that's probably what's going to be most well-rooted in our respective medical centers. We have offices, we've got a nursing magnet program, we've got a quality leaders training academy, and also from trainees and practicing physicians, a number of quality improvement projects that are all within this methodologic scope of quality improvement. And that's really a critical part of learning health overall. What I'm going to focus most of our time on today is our effectiveness research platform, which again is sponsored through our local CTSA award. And we use this somewhat interchangeably with the term VICTOR, the Vanderbilt Institute for Clinical and Translational Research, which administers our local CTSA. And I'll be sharing with you in detail about the platform we've developed there over the last several years. We also have other research programs, including the Center for Health Services Research, and participate in a number of research networks, which are part of our comparative effectiveness research programs. And then, of course, dissemination and implementation science is a part of this as well. The Center for Clinical Quality and Implementation Research is our academic home for D&I science at Vanderbilt. And we have a consulting core as well as a dissemination core, which are part of that. Now, undergirding all of this is a very strong informatics program here, both in clinical informatics and research informatics. We're lucky to be the home of REDCap, which we utilize quite a lot in our day-to-day work. There's platforms for stakeholder engagement through a patient family advisory council, local experts in community engagement, and a steering committee, which I'll describe, which we use as part of our learning healthcare platform, which ensures we have stakeholder engagement from a variety of levels and places in our operational departments in the medical center. There are also a number of effector arms, what I'll call D&I in practice. This is not the D&I science, this is the D&I doing. So we've got a clinical advisory committee that is largely led by our department chairs. There are clinical decision support programs, and there are other tools through our population health management programs to help carry best practices out into regular clinical care. And I'd be remiss to not mention the importance of all of those things. If, as we generate new evidence, they really help get it into practice. And then we're very fortunate to have a number of strong training programs, 2 at the postdoctoral level, and 2 at the junior faculty level, which allow us to have an environment in which trainees can be brought into all phases of this work. So before talking about the Pragmatic Clinical Trials platform, I'm going to talk about a couple of the other entities at Vanderbilt that support our learning health ecosystem. One is the Center for Health Services Research, which at Vanderbilt is a very large umbrella center that engages more than 160 faculty from really across all the departments in the medical center, as well as multiple schools, medicine, nursing, and our graduate school of management. There is a very, very active extramural funding research portfolio as investigators are engaged in a number of different areas. And we support approximately 30 postdoctoral and junior faculty trainees through programs in health services research. I mentioned this is an umbrella center, so within it are about 15 individual centers, which have a variety of areas of focus. I've just put about half of them here. Within each of these, there are embedded research studies that are being done. That may not be the focus of an individual center, but for example, the Center for Quality Aging works very, very closely with nursing homes in the region and does embedded research and implementation research to not only evaluate practice, but improve practice through a number of mentored implementation initiatives. And there are others in critical care, health behavior research, and the other areas listed here. One which is near and dear to my heart is the Center for Clinical Quality and Implementation Research. Again, this is our academic home for implementation science at Vanderbilt. We design and lead innovative research and training initiatives focused on improvement and implementation. So it's a big tent inclusive of quality improvement research and implementation science, all with the goal of improving quality and value of care delivery. It's very applied implementation science research center. We've got about 35 faculty with expertise in a variety of areas who are part of this center. And through the Center for Health Services Research, we help support a lot of the trainees who are interested in D&I science and learning health system science. Here are just some examples of extramural research being done through the CCQIR. As you can see, there's a very applied flavor to this, and I give them as examples also of partnerships between the researchers and some of the operational leaders. So one of our newest ones is about incorporating a clinical decision support tool for identifying low-risk heart failure patients who come into the emergency department and tend to get admitted to the hospital, but many of them could probably be discharged. And so we're using D&I science to incorporate this into the workflow of emergency department physicians and evaluate it in a multi-site study to see what effect it has on patient outcomes. Another one involved a partnership with our employee diabetes health program and adapts the CDC diabetes prevention program to a remote telehealth delivery model to use among our employees in the medical center. There are a couple of other examples here that involve working with nursing homes, one to facilitate deprescribing in cases of polypharmacy, and one of our current initiatives is focused on improving COVID prevention and treatment in area nursing homes. And all of these use D&I science to really carry out the research studies. So how do these two research centers really work as part of our learning health system? Well, as the Director of Health Services Research, I can tell you that this is one of our 3 strategic priorities for growth. We're partnering actively with high priority operational initiatives to bring research techniques into the operational arena to help evaluate some of the initiatives that are going on a day-to-day basis and really partner on these embedded research studies. Another aspect is we provide complementary expertise when we work with our clinical trials platform to bring in investigators with a history of doing patient-centered outcomes research, comparative effectiveness research, health communication, health behavior, and some of the other areas listed here. And that complements very well the group of clinical trialists and biostatisticians who also form part of our learning healthcare platform. And really through all this, we're trying to bring these additional disciplines to the table for embedded research and evaluate not only what interventions work best, but for whom and in what settings. So I mentioned there are 4 career development programs. I won't go into detail on these, but 2 of them are at the K-12 level to support junior faculty, and 2 of them are at the postdoctoral level. Our longest standing program is the VA Quality Scholars Program. We're one of the inaugural sites for that, and have 55 alumni, many of whom actually continue to work in the medical center. And this has actually been a huge advantage for working with clinical and operational leaders, because many of them have over the years received training in improvement science and implementation science through this program. And the other programs listed here are federally funded through NIH, ARC, and also PCORI. And the PIs are pictured below. So let's shift gears now and focus the remainder of the time on the Pragmatic Trials platform, which I think is one of the more innovative aspects of our learning healthcare system at Vanderbilt, and what I was invited to mostly talk about today. A traditional approach involves clinicians like me saying, gosh, there's problems in the system. Somebody really ought to do something about that. We may or may not get involved in an informal initiative. And often the questions and the problems and the approaches that are brought to bear on that problem are not particularly structured and wouldn't generate generalizable scientific knowledge. So our overarching approach has been to take that energy and the insight of the frontline clinicians and other leaders and structure an approach to evaluating solutions to the problems that are being identified in clinical care on a daily basis in our medical center. And that involves developing really tight, manageable research questions, being clear on what a structured intervention is, embedding into the routine workflow, often a test of 2 different approaches that are being considered, using passive data capture, and then rigorously evaluating the effectiveness of two approaches in practice. And this is really effectiveness research, and that's to be differentiated from typical efficacy or explanatory trials on a number of different dimensions. I won't go through this in detail, but if we think about an efficacy or explanatory study versus a pragmatic or effectiveness trial, they differ in the types of questions, setting, the population, and providers. Just for example, the setting for an efficacy trial is often very controlled, whereas an effectiveness trial is going to be in the real world setting. The population of patients in an efficacy trial is going to be highly selected. In an effectiveness trial, it's going to be, well, as many people as we can get, and they're very, very heterogeneous. There are many other dimensions like the intervention, cost, duration to conclusions, what types of outcomes we might want to look at, and what is then likely to be the time course for subsequent implementation. So just to highlight one or two of these things, for an effectiveness trial that's embedded and pragmatic, the cost to carry out that trial has to be very low. And it tends to be very low because we're doing things and delivering care through the regular environment. We don't have to pay for somebody to interview patients. We don't have to pay for somebody to recruit patients. We don't have to pay for data collection or pay for a study drug or things like that. All that is delivered through the regular process of care. And so they're incredibly efficient financially. And from a time period, and I'll come back to this in more detail, they can often be conducted quite a bit more quickly than an efficacy study. So there are a lot of considerations that go into supporting this type of embedded effectiveness pragmatic trial model. One is a recognition that you got to have a lot of tools at your disposal because these are sometimes very complex clinical questions. You often have to think through the local clinical care environment in order to frame that research study. There are a lot of barriers to initiating and conducting these studies. If we were to start from scratch on every single study, it would take a lot of effort. But there's a lot of infrastructure available and which can be developed to make each question, sort of each study, build on all the learnings from the previous studies, not in terms of the specific clinical question that was asked, but the method for doing it. And so we decided in our prior CTSA application to propose a module which would develop a scalable, adaptable, and reusable framework for doing these types of embedded pragmatic trials. And we're now about 4 years into this journey. So what does this look like? At a very high level, we call this the platform. It's the Pragmatic Clinical Trials Effectiveness Platform. There's a process for reviewing ideas, and then interventions are put through this reusable architecture, which is minded by a very capable group of project coordinators, many of whom are actually on the webinar today. And we reutilize approaches and methods to streamline this process of conducting and evaluating these outcomes. And then we ask at the end, which one's better? Or did this approach, improve care over the usual care model? And then we're poised to implement or de-implement findings along with publishing the work so that others can learn from our experience. So going into a little bit more detail on this, at the early stage, when somebody has an idea, it's often born out of a clinical question. I'll give examples of this in a few minutes. We have a method to brainstorm and discuss ways in which that clinical question could be answered through a pragmatic clinical trial. We identify collaborators who need to be brought in. There's a process for helping with literature review. We spend a good bit of effort designing a good clinical trial and also take into account the regulatory considerations and just pull in people as needed. In the next major phase of work where the project is now got some bones and some plans, there's project management. We have certain cores that we can engage. So for example, if somebody needs input from the biostatistics core or a health communication core. We have those services set up already, and they can be brought in. We have studios, which are intensive focus group discussions with multidisciplinary investigators and other stakeholders that can really hash through different aspects of projects. We've got assistance for drafting brief protocols, developing statistical analysis plans where needed, a data safety monitoring board, registering the trial with clinicaltrials.gov, and then getting an overview of what the data management should look like as we engage our health IT colleagues about capturing as much of that as possible in an automated fashion. And then as the study is conducted, data management support ensures that the data remain high quality. There's a great statistical analysis team, and there's also assistance with manuscript development and dissemination of findings, both locally and through the peer-reviewed literature. And because of our stakeholder engagement, as I mentioned before, we're poised to implement or de-implement the findings. So another way of looking at how this is structured is really from an org chart perspective. There's executive leadership, which includes the principal investigator of RCTSA, Gordon Bernard. There are other aspects of the infrastructure here. And on a day-to-day basis, a lot of the magic happens here in the program manager level, the faculty leads who are working on the study design, and in the workshops and other committees that are occurring. But all this feeds up through steering committees and some structured governance, really to the highest levels of the medical center. So this is a big group of people. On the left shown here are the operational leaders, which are part of our executive leadership committee for learning healthcare. This includes the chief nursing officer, the head of the pharmacy, the president of the hospital, the executive VP for the clinics, and the chief operating officer. So they're all literally at the table with the researchers, hearing about, weighing in on what questions are important, and participating in making sure that their executive level decision-making concerns, like what would matter to them at the end of a particular study, that those things are incorporated. We might consider that to a bit like designing for dissemination. The infrastructure is led by Jill Pulley and Cheryl Gatto, who manage this on a really extraordinary level. And our research leadership includes many, many people, including on the next slide. Dr. Bernard's head of our CTSA. Chris Lenzel leads the methods for all of this. Bob Dittus helped start all this and now moved over to a CIO position. And Todd Rice is a pragmatic trialist and also the medical director of our IRB. So they're all really critical to this. Lots more people. And we've got representation from nursing, education, pharmacy, the quality leaders from the medical center are part of this as well. And then a variety of people providing scientific and community engagement expertise. Not done yet, there's more. There's extraordinary biostatisticians. Frank Harrell here on the top left founded the Department of Biostats at Vanderbilt and remains engaged in this and pushes us on methods all the time. Our bioinformatics group is really exceptional with Paul Harris of Red Cap renown, and Adam Wright leads our clinical informatics center. And importantly, other folks who are involved in the operational side of the informatics. It's not just the academic informaticists, but also the operational informaticists like Mark Beller are part of this. And just several of our great project team leads are pictured here as well, who help shepherd projects and make sure everything runs well. So when you put all this together, you've got a really great level of stakeholder engagement. These are just some of the individual roles that are represented at the research level, at the hospital operations level, as clinicians, and also patients in the community. So if you're a Vanderbilt investigator or a clinician or operational manager and you have an idea, what does this look like to you? You come forward to the group, usually just through submitting a little ticket through REDCap, say, hey, I've got an idea, heard about this learning healthcare system thing. How do I do it? And then you meet with people and get an administrative review, and they help develop a tight answerable question, which is brought to a workshop. So you have these workshops weekly. We spend an hour hashing through these ideas. And it's a multidisciplinary group of people, including folks like me, biostatisticians, clinical trialists, and others, project managers, very important, and really just hash through all this. And then after that, we develop a one-pager with the investigator or clinician. That's then brought, it's refined a bit and brought to the executive committee for review. So they sign off on these projects, and that also helps them know what's going on, and they know, what's in the pipeline for getting results later that they might want to do something about. And then we launch. And so from start to finish, what I've got here on this slide, probably takes about 2 months or so. It's pretty quick. It just depends on the starting point for the study in terms of how quickly this part can go. And there are a lot of projects that have gone through this system, and we've evolved over time in how they're tracked. I won't go through this in detail, but we've got some different project placemats that help us know sort of what stage each project is in. And there are little icons here. This is an older version, which evolved to this, which we reviewed at every steering committee meeting. And now our current form looks like this. And what's present in all of these is the life cycle of a project, from the ideation to the review and design period. We got some icons to indicate whether it's adult or pediatric, hospital or ambulatory. Is the study yet active? Is it completed? And then what's happened after that in terms of dissemination, integration into practice, et cetera, presentations and things like that. So this is actually a representation of the projects that are currently in queue as of a few weeks ago, and some that have been fairly recently completed. So over the last year, just to give you an idea of the numbers of things that go through, we've had about 11 finished projects. This is 11 pragmatic clinical trials. They're pretty big, about 3,000 to 4,000 on average is the study sample. We've got work going on in 25 or more areas of the hospital and also in the clinics. And the average study length is 12 months. So this was a priority that was set up because we have a certain amount of resources and bandwidth to support this work. So we didn't want to get involved in 4-year-long studies. We're explicitly picking studies that can be completed within 12 months. And so there are a lot of other metrics that we track to keep up with, the productivity of the group. There are a variety of different things that can come through the platform, and this just shows several examples. One is, patients who are admitted to the hospital with COVID-19 who are not yet in the intensive care unit and hopefully won't be. We know in the ICU, it helps to flip them on their belly to breathe better, but we don't know for patients who are not in critical care whether proning them is helpful. So that's an example of something that can be and has been investigated through one of our pragmatic clinical trials. There are others about using penicillin allergy labels and getting rid of those, where somebody said, yeah, I think I had a rash when I was a kid. And having a penicillin allergy live on their chart makes them less likely to get appropriate antibiotics. And so there are a variety of settings and kinds of questions that can be asked through our platform. I want to give several examples. I'll go through these pretty quickly. My purpose is not to get into detail on the study, but just to illustrate the kind of work that's been done. So one of the first ones that went through the platform was a pragmatic trial testing 2 different types of IV fluids. So basically, if you're trained as an internal medicine physician, you use normal saline. If you trained as a surgeon, you use something called lactated ringers. And it's just been that way for decades. And Matt Semler and colleagues asked the question, well, which is better? And conducted a large pragmatic trial at our hospital in patients, both in the emergency department. There was one study and another one in the intensive care units, randomizing patients to receive one fluid or the other. And this was done as a cluster randomized controlled trial with multiple crossover. And this demonstrated that the balanced crystalloid formulation, or what we would call lactated ringers, was actually superior to the normal saline and had better outcomes, especially in terms of kidney function.
Sunil, I have a question.
Yeah.
This is Donna Spiegelman from Yale. So sometimes when I talk to colleagues about doing things similar to this, then they bring up the IRB issues and consent and all of that sort of thing. And they feel like we can't do these things because of IRB and consent. And you mentioned this was a cluster RCT, but then it sounded like it was individually randomized. So I wasn't sure, but it seems like with those barriers of consent and IRB, it's maybe easier, people think, if you're cluster randomizing than. Anyway, I'm just wondering if you could comment on that, because this is just a perfect example where a lot of people would say, oh, no way.
Yeah, that's a great question, Donna. Thank you. So in general, the interventions or the approaches to care that we're testing are both alternatives are accepted and used in clinical practice.
Yeah, no, I know that's given.
Yeah. So our view on this is that people could randomly, through who happens to be their doctor, get one fluid or the other, or we could randomize them to get one or the other. So we've actually done patient level randomization. We've done this cluster RCT in which ICUs were randomized month to month in terms of which fluid would be stocked. And we've also done quasi-randomized studies. I'm going to give examples of each of those. But in all of these, we generally do not do patient level informed consent.
Okay, and then how is it that your institutions have agreed that that's okay? Because when I hear the only way you can do these things and not have patient level informed consent is when you call it quality improvement. And then if you call it quality improvement, then you can't disseminate the results in any way.
Right.
So that's where people get stuck. So how did you overcome that?
Yeah. So over many years, we've worked with our IRB and they're phenomenal. We propose studies through this platform that are generally going to be minimal risk or no additional risk to the patient. And our IRB approves these, if appropriate, with a waiver of obtaining informed consent. So I do recognize not every institution's IRB is the same, but our IRB for actually a number of years has been supportive of rigorous randomized controlled trials that if you're testing two things that are accepted in clinical practice and pose no meaningful additional risk to the patient, they do not require that we get individual patient level informed consent to do this type of work. There are a couple of examples of studies where what has been tested crosses that line a little bit, and our IRB tells us, yes, you do need to get patient level informed consent, but that's not the focus of what we do for the 90+% of the trials that go through our platform.
Because in implementation science, we're only studying, like, let's say you identified balanced crystalloids as the better intervention, then the next step would be implementation science, how to get all the providers to use that, because just because you showed it was. So in implementation science, we're already looking at an evidence-based intervention and just trying to figure out how to effectively roll it out and get it to be sustained. And people think you need informed consent for that.
No, certainly not.
They do.
I'd be happy to talk with you. I'd be happy to talk offline about some of the approaches that we use in collaboration with our IRB. And it's very much a partnership. Thank you again for the question. Another example, and this may really blow people's minds if the last one was a question of informed consent, is another one of our pulmonary critical care physicians, John Casey, recently did this work with the help of our trial. It's called a pre-event study. So one of the questions that has really been not fundamental, but unanswered in the emergency intubation of patients is so imagine patients in the emergency department needs to be intubated. They get given a sedative, and then there's about a minute in there between when the sedative is given and the patient's not breathing anymore and the tube goes in. And about half of clinicians felt like, gosh, during that minute, we really need to be ventilating the patient with what's called a bag. And we give them air in the lungs, that's good. But a lot of other people have said, gosh, that may push some air into the stomach and increase their risk of aspirating contents. And we don't like that idea. So John and colleagues developed and conducted another pragmatic clinical trial to test randomized patients to either get bag mask ventilation in that minute before they get intubated or not. And I give this as an example, again, not to go into the details about the physiology, but to show that this can be done even in an emergency, literally 1 minute setting where there's a pertinent clinical decision, where there's clinical equipoise in practice. And this one was accepted from informed consent under other conditions for emergency care research, which is a very complex topic I don't have time to get into today, nor am I an expert in it. But it's another example of using a pragmatic trial to answer a fundamental clinical question. And what they found was that indeed bag masking the patient for that minute substantially improved their outcomes in terms of oxygenation with no measurable harm, and really answered this question, which has been around in clinical practice for many, many years. That third example by one of our allergists and also K-12 awardees, Cosby Stone, was looking at this question of penicillin allergy. And he's actually been a repeat customer, which must mean our trials platform is working. His first study was called Propel. And what he did is design a study to identify patients who had a penicillin allergy sitting on their chart. There's a process for figuring out who's low risk based on the circumstances of what happened when they got penicillin allergy, when they got the penicillin and how long it had been. And among those low risk patients, and if they were willing, so here's a patient buy-in part, and they consented to get this, they got a single dose amoxicillin challenge. And if they didn't have a reaction to it, they're not allergic to penicillin. And he has rolled out through a stepped wedge randomized control trial across our entire hospital this approach, evaluating the extent to which it can successfully delabel patients with a low risk penicillin allergy and therefore enable their clinicians to give more appropriate antibiotics. He's doing a second study like this with the platform to help in the outpatient setting, engaging patients who, again, have a penicillin allergy sitting on their chart, but probably don't really have a penicillin allergy. A fourth example by one of our pharmacists. Autumn Zuckerman came to the Learning Health System platform originally wanting to demonstrate the benefit of specialty pharmacy services for patients with a particular condition, multiple sclerosis, who get very expensive medications. And she thought, gosh, the stakes are so high, the costs are so high, these medications. If we give them additional support from the pharmacist side, is it worth the investment to do that? And through discussion with the Learning Healthcare platform, actually ended up reframing the study and broadening it to evaluate the overall benefits of the specialty pharmacy services. And then she's also joined the steering committee to represent the pharmacy as part of our group because their input is so important in a number of studies. I give this as an example to show that these workshops where people bring ideas in really do have the potential to completely change the types of questions and forms of research that are being done. The last example I'll give is by one of our fellows, Eddie Chen, who is co-leading a study that's now been completed and is presently under review for publication about this COVID situation that I mentioned. So, in spite of the pandemic, we've been able to go forward with most of these clinical trials and even develop trials to address aspects of care during the pandemic. So as I alluded to before, we don't really know whether asking patients to lay on their stomach improves their ability to breathe and get oxygen in their lungs if they're hospitalized with COVID. We know it works in the ICU, but we don't know whether it works in a regular hospital environment. And there were some case series published suggesting it might, but we did a pragmatic randomized controlled trial using a quasi-randomization here, where according to the patient's medical record number, odd or even, they got instructions to either go about their business in their room or asked to lay themselves on their stomach as much as they felt comfortable during the day. And we've been able to evaluate the effectiveness of this technique. So there have been a lot of lessons learned. One is that we really need to get commitment and at the high level early on. If we're ultimately going to be asking for part of the medical center to potentially change its practice based on the results of the study, we've got to engage those leaders and managers at the very beginning to be sure they have a voice in the study. Getting clearly defined interventions that can be articulated and replicated is important. And then collaborating and facilitating this work across a broad group of people has been important as well. There have been some barriers. We recognize it takes resources to do this type of work. So we very specifically tried to orient the resources we have towards studies that can be done in a very cost-effective, timely way. Things where we don't have to buy new medications and buy fancy monitoring devices and hire additional personnel. It really has to be something that can be done within the fabric of care. We try not to tackle too much at once. And also, there are cases where there's been discussion about collecting a lot of data, but usually the more parsimonious approach makes it more feasible, and that's been our tendency. We've also evolved a lot. The last
Sunil,
couple of minutes.
Something about that, which is the data issue. So all along, I was thinking there was no additional data collection, and all the information was coming from the electronic medical records. And I might have missed if you're on Epic or you have your own system, but yeah. I had assumed there was no additional data collection.
There's very little additional data collection. One example, which I'm going to give in a moment, is around some fidelity work. So stay tuned. So as we've evolved and people have brought additional questions into the platform, it's really prompted advancements in a number of areas, and prompted us to think about how we're going to judge pragmatism and what to do when an intervention is simple and what to do when it's complex. And then there's some future directions that we're planning. So without going into this in detail, again, the number of different study concepts and ideas that have been brought forward have prompted us, for example, to create a mechanism for a DSMB, which we didn't have at the beginning of the Pragmatic Trials platform, but certain studies warranted it. And so now we've got a standing sort of reusable framework for a data safety monitoring board. There have been 1 or 2 trials where we've embedded informed consent into it. And one of our lessons learned has been that those take a lot more work and they require additional personnel. And that's not really where the strength of this platform is. So we periodically try that, and we're doing some things with e-consent from time to time, but we're continuing to look at how much of a risk-based study can we have without increasing the requirements for informed consent so much that it ceases to be feasible and practical within our framework. We're expanding into multi-site studies. We're using newer techniques like Bayesian analyses, and we're growing our presence both locally and through social media. One of the things that we started out, we wanted to do pragmatic clinical trials from the beginning, but we hadn't really adopted a model for how we were going to judge the pragmatism of a trial. So as the platform has gone on, pretty early on, we adopted the PRECI2 framework for thinking about our studies. And I imagine most everybody here is familiar with this, so I won't go into it in detail, but I'm just going to put an example here of one trial that we did of post-discharge phone calls to patients where we looked at, how pragmatic is it along these different domains. And this is pretty representative of the kinds of studies and the degree of pragmatism in our trials. But From a practical level, we actually only focus on 4 areas most of the time. So I want to just highlight those. These deviate from the PRESC-2 framework. We still find that useful, but to think about what trials we can best use our strengths towards supporting, it comes down to these 4 things. Is it feasible to randomize? Because we are, after all, doing pragmatic randomized control trials. That's our focus of this particular platform. And could it be done at either the patient, provider, unit, or system level? Any of those is fine, but you need to be able to randomize. The second is, what's the level of informed consent required? If it will require a detailed individual informed consent level, that's not really the best research study to try to support through this trial platform. Are there data readily available? And this gets back to Donna's question about use of health IT resources. Can we readily identify the patient population of interest and readily identify outcomes? It's okay if we occasionally have some supplementary data that's collected manually or through some other kind of device, but I'd say 98% of our data, including the patient identification as well as the outcomes, is all harvested from the electronic health record. And is there enough volume of patients with this particular condition and this particular circumstance to be able to do the study within a year? And so these are the 4 things that we tend to focus on most when we're evaluating studies for support. I want to leave some time for questions at the end, so I'm just going to zip through these last few things. We decided to adopt the tidier framework for detailing the aspects of the intervention to enhance its replicability. For more complex interventions, we recognize tidier doesn't work too well, and so we're using the PCORI methodology standards. Not a lot of interventions really fit in this category yet, so we're still gaining experience with this. But this is what we're planning on using as those cases arise. As we go forward in our next cycle of our CTSA, we are explicitly incorporating more implementation science into these trials. Most of them are pure effectiveness studies. We have had a couple so far that I would call hybrid type 1 studies, and we're planning on doing more of that. And I think this is going to require some additional supplementary data collection along with those effectiveness outcomes. And then we'd like to do more hybrid type 2 and 3 studies where we're testing implementation strategies against each other. We're starting to get into intervention fidelity a bit. So for example, in the COVID proning study, we separately got a device that allowed us to measure the degree to which a patient was proning, and we used that in a sample of patients to help validate that proning was actually occurring more in the intervention group compared to the control group as a way of checking on the fidelity. We're developing dissemination tools and then dashboards for monitoring the uptake of the practice. I'll just show you one example of this from our IV fluid study. I know there's a lot going on here. Just to briefly orient you to this, there's the nursing units at the top, and from top to bottom is early to late. And so if you go, think of it as chronologically. And what we looked at is a heat map of which units were adopting the proper IV fluids that were evidence-based, and then use this as a way of fostering uptake of findings in the medical center once we had those study results. The last things that we're focusing on as we go forward are scaling more to ambulatory and pediatric settings. We've definitely done more hospital-based work the last few years. We have a number of outpatient studies and pediatric studies going on now, and we'll have more in the future. We're going to be more intentional about incorporating health equity considerations into the selection of studies and their conduct. We're using more predictive analytics and incorporating those, and as I mentioned, Bayesian analysis for some of these. And then we're also recognizing that not everybody is going to benefit the same way, and so we're planning on looking more at heterogeneity of treatment effects going forward. And some of these trials are large enough to allow us to look within certain groups of patients to say, well, for patients like me, how would I do under this type of care versus that type of care? And then we're also hoping to disseminate some of the resources for this, whether it's the EPIC to REDCap modules, other data collection tools, or the workshop facilitation materials. So this is still very much a work in progress, but we look forward to continuing to share as we go forward. So thanks so much for the invitation to join you all. I'm glad we had a chance to do a few questions during the presentation. I'd be happy to answer any others.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sunil. This is a wonderful talk and a really great overview of your system and some great examples. Just looking at the chat and some of the questions that came up as you were talking, there's a lot of interest in your stakeholder engagement in your projects. And I'm wondering if you can comment on sort of two ends of that spectrum. One was around senior leadership and developing and nurturing that engagement. And then on the other end of the spectrum, thinking about how you engage patients and maybe commenting a little bit on the depth of their engagement and different ways you've done that.
Yeah, thanks so much. From a leadership level, and I do very much think that these leaders are stakeholders. Sometimes we only think about patients as being stakeholders, but the managers and leaders are. They've been very interested in being part of this process. And, there's some natural change in roles and evolution of their roles over time. And so the composition of the exact individuals has evolved over even the last 4 years, as CEO changes, et cetera. But we always invite the new person in to be part of the group. And they've really proven to be, excellent partners in this. We don't include them in the day-to-day weedy stuff, but rather in these monthly steering committee and executive meetings. Maybe it's part of the culture of the institution, but it's really been, I think, one of the biggest benefits of this and bringing the research and operational leadership communities together. At the patient level, our engagement happens on multiple fronts. We've got 2 or 3 standing patient advisory groups in the medical center. So for certain high-level things, we present to them. For example, questions of, how might patients like results return to them, or what kinds of things might you want to know about the kinds of studies being done in the hospital while you're a patient at the hospital. Those high-level things we take to those advisory groups. We have patients and other non-healthcare professionals sitting in on our meetings and weighing in, and they're active participants in the discussions. And then also we have dedicated expertise that can be triggered if somebody needs direct patient input from community members. Then we can sort of take an aside, convene a group, which we call our community engagement studios, and then bring that input into the project. So I think it's helpful to have it at different levels.
Great, thank you. While we're taking a couple more questions, just a note to everybody, the evaluation link is in the chat. We really appreciate your feedback. Another thing that came up in the chat in terms of questions was thinking about the relationship between sort of trials in a learning health system and QI projects, and what the relationship is between those two. Do the QI projects go through similar processes, or are they really seen as a competing effort in the health system, and how you've navigated that? So if you
that's
comment on that.
Wonderful question. So our QI projects go through, I think, different processes depending on where they're birthed. If it's a medical student or nursing leader who's proposing a project, they'll probably work with their local environment and advisors to get it done. If it's a medical center level priority, and it goes through our equivalent of a chief quality officer, they have an infrastructure to support it and tend to use approaches like the IHI model for carrying out that work and resourcing it. I would say it's not at all competing. Usually very different types of things are brought to the learning healthcare platform or quality improvement. I think that what we're seeing sometimes is people may bring an idea to the learning healthcare platform, and we see in the group, it's not really well suited to be conducted as a pragmatic clinical trial. And so we'll actually move it over to our implementation science core, where we may work with them and use different methods for helping them evaluate a project. And that handoff and partnership is done pretty seamlessly because a couple of us who are applied implementation scientists are part of the learning healthcare platform, and we can just move the project over pretty easily.
I'm going to ask you one more question. I want to acknowledge we're at 1 o'clock, and I'm sure we have some people dropping off, but your answer led to me to think about one of the other questions that came up really early on, and thinking about your ecosystem development and how many of the sort of resources and units were pre-existing and brought together versus developed new to be able to really implement a learning health system and do the work that you do. So if you could speak to that, I think that'll be our last question. So thank you to everybody as we get close to wrapping up here.
So all the things on that ecosystem slide sort of developed over time. None of this was overnight. We had a quality office for decades. The Center for Health Services Research is 20 years old. These training programs sort of came along, on their own. The informatics have developed over time. I think, most medical centers have that dynamic environment where things are always growing and being created. One of the challenges then is how do you link all that together? And we're still working on that. I'm sure everybody is, in similar environments, but by collaborating and having open dialogue and just getting to know and work with each other and pull people in, we're trying to create that overall ecosystem. And as I've mentioned at least a couple of times, it's definitely still in evolution. The part that, has a defined start, I'd say was the learning healthcare platform, because that was explicitly part of our CTSA renewal. And it's just really taken off over the last 4 years. And we look forward to continuing to grow that as part of the overall environment.
All right. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. If you get a chance to look at the chat, we've got some positive comments from people about the information you just shared. We want to thank you again for joining us, and thank you everyone for coming to see Dr. Kripalani's talk. Again, fill out the evaluation on your way out, and we'll see you again for upcoming education programs, seminars in the next few weeks. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.